really dealing with something in a different paradigm. The vocabulary of almost everything you're trying to say is different. You have to somehow establish the terms in order to use those as stepping stones to arrive at what you're trying to say. And people aren't used to it taking that long for you to get the picture to them. And we had moved out into sort of a country outside of Portland, in the woods, and a creek right near us. And so there was a lot of freedom and sort of nature all around. And I didn't get involved in the sort of kind of city activities or a lot of interaction with a lot of people, so there was quite a bit of reflective time, and I read a lot and roamed the woods with my brother, and I think that sort of meant I could generate sort of my own picture about the world, and there wasn't anything to drag me into reality too often, except the things I tried to make or build that wouldn't work. But some assumption, because I had so little resources, was that I really didn't know how, or really probably couldn't do it like other people could, so it didn't seem to dismay me much if I failed. And I think that proclivity to sort of dream the picture and then say, let's go, and also the assumption somehow that, well, I wasn't like the other people. I didn't understand their clubs or the way they operated socially, and I didn't really sort of feel like I necessarily had to try, so it didn't bother me if I was different. And then many years later, when I was in the service, I had time to think through a lot of things like that, and so one of them I generated this sort of algorithm, or something that's like, the rate at which a person can mature is directly proportional to how much embarrassment he can tolerate. And I thought, that's that for me was that sort of embarrassment didn't seem to bother me very much, because from the way I started and the perspective I had about the world. So, all right. And then something that Benjamin Franklin wrote too was so beautiful about that. He says, you wouldn't worry half so much about what other people thought of you if you realized how seldom they did. See? And I'd say, oh, that's right. So, and so I was in the Navy, and I was shipped to some little island, and they would put you in a camp that they call a receiving ship, even though it's on land. And you're there for some unknown number of days till somebody says, hey, it's Engelbart, you're going to be sent to so-and-so. Where's that? Don't ask me questions, just get on that boat. But during that time, I found a funny little Red Cross library up on a Filipino hut. It was up on stilts, and it was up in there, and there was nobody there. All these little books and things, so I spent a lot of time there. I found that Life magazine article by Vannevar Bush, so I can remember being very intrigued by that. And but I didn't carry that around as a big direct goal or something. It didn't surface till quite a bit later, after I'd already made the commitment to augment humans and so on. That it fitted in then with, suddenly I realized how it fitted in with the things I was going to do with computers. And then it just dawned on me one day, just boom, that complexity was the fundamental thing there. The world's problems were complex, and launching any significant crusade or goal towards going after solving any of those problems was also a very complex thing. And it just went click to my mind that if there's some way you could contribute significantly to the way humans could handle complexity and urgency, that you'd contribute something very basic that could not only help us get there, it would be very universally helpful. And I put together very quickly then the possibilities of the very, very immature computer world that was just emerging, and about which I'd read one popularized book. But since I had been an electrical engineer and electronics and radar a lot, I could extrapolate very easily. So I just, flashed in the mind of how it could help people work actually, and not work with numbers, but work with the kind of thinking symbology that we do employ now. And I could picture sitting in front of big cathode ray tubes with a computer, making any kind of symbolic arrays that we would like to develop new forms of that in order to portray for ourselves the thinking that we were doing. And other people could be sitting at similar complexes associated with the same computer world, collaborating. And I just said, wow, tremendous possibilities. And then I said, okay, I'm going to go after that. And that was in the early spring of 1951. So, so that was the driving image. I then, after a few months of negotiation, got a job at SRI, Stanford Research Institute. And when I went there, the first person I interviewed was someone I'd known at Berkeley who was working there. And I told him what I really wanted to do. And he listened and he said, have you talked to anybody else here yet? No, you're the first person I've interviewed. Well, I tell you, I think if you want to get hired, you better not tell people this. It's just too crazy. Oh, he says, you've got plenty with those patents you've done and stuff like that, and the PhD you have. You don't have to worry about getting a job if you sort of just be a good boy and talk about computer technology. And it's all right. So I got a job, and so I started being a good boy and working with other things. So pretty soon I had some more patents, and in a year or so, I was in good standing with the emergent community of high-tech, solid-state circuit people around the country. And then I started saying, but here's what I really want to do. And finally they sort of said, well, you could have part-time to do that. And it was very strange that almost immediately the things I would write and all, from being things people say, oh, great, great. They look puzzled at the new things I would write. And then my boss gave me quite a lecture one day. He says, look, here's 8 pages you've gone through to describe this thing you want to do, and it's still all vague. Now look, here's so-and-so. Bill has just written this proposal on 1 page, very concise and clear, exactly what he wants to do for this research. And here was something very way down in some detail in an intellectual domain that was already all thoroughly beaten out, and he was going to add this new pursuit of that. And I tried to explain to my boss that, hey, this is something that there isn't even vocabulary to use. And that was my first. But many of the things we did explicitly are emerging in one form or another. The hypertext publishing system we called a journal is one of the slowest ones to come out in whole. And some of the architectural principles, but mostly the differences are the orientation about what all this could be for, and the significant impact upon how individuals and organizations will do their knowledge work. That's the thinking and reasoning and communicating and explaining and recording and arguing and proposing, and all of this stuff that has been on paper in the past will be in computer form and shared and moved around. It's that sort of collective image of how all that will be integrated is somewhat missing, and that it's like individual parts of this get moved ahead in early pictures of how they'll be employed. And there isn't that kind of coherent picture of how all that's going to go together to be extremely different social organisms that are going to result from that. And that's a big part of what our agenda is now, is to try to say, well, that's going to be a very different world, and the parts of it that mean we can learn better to harness people's purposes and intellectual knowledge work, etc., a lot more effectively. It'd be very important to accelerate that part of all the consequences of this technology. Otherwise, the rest of the impact and many other things that are happening outpace our ability to cope. And so I know that sort of thinking doesn't in itself appeal to a marketplace, and that many of the people that have brought things out into the marketplace will naturally try to establish a niche in the marketplace that will be profitable. And this is what's driving the products that come out, not the image of that in due time this one form or another of how you employ this will make the biggest difference to your society. And we have to learn how to employ all the aspects of that system that I end up calling an augmentation system. So you're born with just the latent capability to learn, and yet by the time you grow up to be facing, say, being able to take on problems and work at solving things and doing things, you've had to absorb a great how to function within this whole big system, which only a little part of it is the tools that people are so proud of, and the rest of it all has to adapt in order to harness those tools within the human way of thinking, and all of that has to match human basic capabilities to perceive and to motorize, actuate things, and to memorize and remember and to function with thinking capabilities. So all this basic human capability has to learn and adapt to harness all of the rest of this augmentation system. So that augmentation system is very big and complex, and nobody coming in with some whiz-bang technology is going to find that that is the solution for the whole system. The rest of the system has to adapt to it. And so really, all through the generations, these artifacts and everything else is co-evolved. They've co-evolved to create an evolving whole system. And that's the only way we're going to harness all the technology in the future, is the continued co-evolution of all these other aspects of our augmentation system to integrate these others. So to project any of the independent dimensions of the technology on ahead without looking at the rest of the technology and it's going to evolve, plus all the rest of the social, organizational activity and cultural structures that go on into that, that's all going to co-evolve. I mean, that's the future. And so I'm practically given up to thinking that it makes much sense to extrapolate the particular technologies. The really important thing, seems to me, is that you get a process for the evolution of our social and organizational structures, so they can learn to integrate sensibly these things and evolve to harness all that without falling apart or rupturing or falling off a cliff or whatever else organizations do that when they go extinct. There are a number of aspects of my reaction. On one hand, I think it's very good to have such a well-done picture of what can happen. On the other hand, there are problems if it tries to get across and have people take too seriously a lot of the associated interpretations that one can make of that's the expectation of the future. It's really be important to make more and more scenarios by people of the way things can and perhaps even should be in the future. And so I think that's necessary, and this was a very well done one. There are things about it which you know, if it were the only thing and if it were put across as the representation of the future, I would think, well, it stops way short. And there are dangerous things. The personification issue of having a computer act as a person is saying, well, that's a metaphor that's fairly clever, but no matter how you look at it, that's an alien. The computer, the smartest computer you're going to make, is an alien, and it may end up being smarter than people, but you don't want to let yourself ever be lulled into thinking that it is a person, because they're not. And so it'd be important to develop those computers as supportive allies and such with you, but we just very important to keep in mind what they are, as they are automatons. They are creatures that we've made to support us, and don't let us get them confused with people. That they're aliens. It's almost like the picture of if automobiles are going to become very popular. You're picturing that in the future of 100 and some years ago. And you see the country gentleman having his life very much the same. And the car he would get in would look like a horseless carriage or something. The rest of people's lives are going to be changed quite a bit. And it's a little misleading to show it as it is. And it's showing one slice of somebody in an academic sort of setting. They sort of implies that one needs to do a little more than talk to your clerk or your slave. And this is fine for some of the kinds of communication you want to do, but when you actually think that computer support's going to do more for you than just be as some sort of slave to do what you want, that it's also a sort of a vehicle and an instrument by which you fly around and actuate things, and to have things that you control by speaking to them to do your mobility around in some complex space is a little bit misleading to me. I make the analogy sometimes of you find a way to talk your skis down a hill in a very complex way, and you don't. When it's navigating your way down through and responding very fast to something, that speech is a very ineffective way to have a very fine control of something that's navigating its way very rapidly through something. Well, this is the world's first mouse, and it's hand carved out of wood, and the whole principle of the mouse is embodied in these two little wheels underneath. And that one of the principles about a wheel that has sharp edges like that is that as you move it rubbing across the surface, if you happen to be moving it in the rolling direction, its amount of roll will exactly correspond to how far you've moved it. But the one that's perpendicular to that will just be sliding and won't roll at all. Or if you roll it the other direction, this one will slide and the other one will roll. So he says, well, if I want to get from here over to here, I could go like this and like this, and those two amounts of roll, a computer, if it knew how far each wheel was rolling, would tell you how far over this way you went, how far you went this way. Well, it turns out the wheels do a little bit smarter than that if I moved from here diagonally to there, those wheels would each independently have slid and moved just the same amount. So the amount that this wheel rolls is actually how far you've moved in the left and right direction, and this one will tell you how far you've moved in the up and down direction. And if the little potentiometers or other means by which the computer keeps track of how these wheels roll, it'll tell it just how far you've moved in which direction on the paper. So it was just a thought of one way to help work with the person working at the screen to be able to point on the screen to tell the computer what you wanted. And we had one button to say, click on it when you'd first gotten there. And the first one we built, it had the tail coming out the back end and sitting there like that someone thought, just without any particular connection, just start calling it a mouse because we didn't have any other name for it. So one of the interesting things is, by the time it went through the series of tests along with a number of other selection devices that we were employing that we had gotten commercially, and this started to win all the different tests, we all became quite confident that someday people are going to use something like this out there in the world altogether with their computer interactions. But none of us ever thought that they'd still carry the funny little term of a mouse. So that's what was surprising. Not that it came out and got to be popular, but that it was still to be called a mouse rather than some formal something other like a servo control unit or something.